Iran has sharply stepped up its use of public executions, according to Amnesty International. More than a dozen men, including juveniles, have been hanged in public.
On March 16, 2005, thousands stood silent as a crane lifts this guy who had destroyed a town. Minutes later, he's whipped and stabbed for crimes so unthinkable that authorities believed his end had to be public. Here's what happened to the people who preyed on the weak and vulnerable.
The firing squad is fundamentally violent. It uses force to kill. And even if it's not necessarily more painful as an objective matter, it is more violent.
January 26, 1996, just after midnight, strapped into a black metal chair with a dark hood over his head and a white cloth pinned to his chest as a target. 5 officers would stand behind a wall, rifles at the ready. No one says a word. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the countdown begins. 5, 4, 3, and just like that, is done. John Albert Taylor became the second man in modern U.S. history to be executed by firing squad. The first in nearly 20 years. But now to understand how he ended up in that chair, we have to go back, not just for the crime, but to the complicated, chaotic life that led him there. 1959, Taylor's born in Ogden, Utah. His parents split up before he could even remember them together, and by the time he's 9, he's already moved from place to place and told a lie that would stick with him forever, that his father had died. He didn't find out the truth until much later. According to Taylor, home was far from safe. He claimed he was abused, didn't get along with his mother, and was constantly at odds with his stepfather. And by the time he was 13, Taylor stabbed his stepfather, and it's unclear if there were any legal repercussions. So by this point, nearly everybody around Taylor, even doctors and psychologists, were obviously deeply concerned, and he's placed now in a sex offender program during his teens after some serious accusations involving other girls around his age, including his own sister. And yet he kept slipping through the cracks. He would bounce between institutions, ran into the law more than one time, and eventually landed in Florida, where they caught him for burglary and weapons charges. And by his 20s, his criminal record was huge and really deeply concerning. By 1989, Taylor returned to Utah to reconnect with his family. But within days of his arrival, a tragedy unfolds. June 23rd, a girl named Charlotte King was home alone in her apartment in Washington Terrace. She was supposed to go to an amusement park the next day to celebrate her birthday, but she never made it. When her mother got home from work that afternoon, she finds her daughter in the bedroom, and what she finds is deeply disturbing and heartbreaking. Her life had been taken in a way that no girl should ever face. The scene left investigators with little doubt that she'd been violated before her murder, with the nightgown wrapped around her head and underwear shoved into her mouth. For 2 days, police searched for answers. Then a phone call came in. It was Taylor's own sister, Lori. She gave him a tip that pointed right to her brother. Taylor had been staying in the same apartment complex. His fingerprints were found on a phone inside King's home. Also, witnesses place him nearby around the same time of the crime, and within days, he's arrested at a relative's house. Taylor doesn't ask for a jury. Instead, he chose a bench trial, just a judge, and he claimed he'd broken into the apartment while no one was home and only touched the phone when he was looking for money. But the details aren't adding up. There were no signs of a break-in, nothing valuable had been taken, and there was no doubt that someone had violently attacked Charla. A fellow inmate even testified that Taylor admitted he was responsible, calling it an accident. And it's no surprise that the judge, too, didn't buy the burglary story. So by December 5th, 1989, Taylor's found guilty of both and murder. 2 weeks later, he's sentenced to death. And for the next several years, Taylor would sit on death row. He got his high school diploma, started studying law, and tried to stay busy. But his health would be declining fast. He had heart problems, ulcers, chronic pain, and so he started to lose hope. By 1995, after one last appeal was denied, he finally gave up. He fires his lawyer and told the court he's done fighting. Then came a decision that surprised everybody. He chose the firing squad instead of a lethal injection. Why? Well, it said that Taylor wanted to make the state uncomfortable because, he claimed, they knew they were executing an innocent man. He wanted to prove a point, saying this would be his way of protesting. And maybe, deep down, he wanted to just die quietly. The day before his execution, Taylor seemed calm, but not exactly peaceful. He had butterflies, as he told his uncle, Gordon Lee, sharing his last meal with him, a pizza with everything on it and a Coke. They would talk, laugh, and try to ignore the reality of what was coming. Taylor refused sedatives, said his stomach was doing flips, so no to coffee, and even asked for an antacid. He then wrote up his will, talked with a priest who had baptized him a week earlier, and would get his first cigarette in 6 years. And then just before midnight, he's led into this warehouse. The room's cold, bright lights focused on his chest, sandbags stacked behind him to catch any bullet. 5 officers stand behind a wall. One of the rifles holds a blank round, so none of these people know who fired the fatal shot. At 12:03 a.m., the countdown begins, and 5 seconds later, 4 bullets struck Taylor in the chest. His body jolted, his hands clenched, and then went still. He's pronounced dead at 12:07 a.m. Taylor's body's cremated, and his ashes are sent to his uncle. On his death certificate, the cause was listed as homicide, because in the eyes of the law, an execution still counts as death by another's hand. Now, that same day, a bill was introduced into the Utah House to end firing squads for good. It would eventually pass years later. The media coverage was so intense that over 160 journalists showed up, and some called the firing squad barbaric, but others said it was justice. Now, for Charlotte King's family, there's no debate. Her mother once said,
"They say executing him is barbaric? Tell me what's barbaric. My daughter was alive when it happened. He won't even hear the sound of the bullets."
Bill, do you think about death every day?
No,
I don't.
But if my death were scheduled to be tomorrow, I might.
Well, I'm not.
So you're not frightened at all?
You accept the things you cannot change.
Welcome to May 10th, 1994, at Stateville Correctional Center, Illinois. We got John Wayne Gasey strapped to a gurney, staring at the ceiling of his chamber. Outside, a crowd had gathered, some silent, some celebrating. A few were even grilling, tailgating like a festival. They would blast "Na Na Hey Hey Kiss 'Em Goodbye" so loud that the song echoed throughout the prison. Inside, the man once known as Pogo the Clown was oddly calm. He just finished his last meal, some fried chicken, shrimp fries, and strawberries. Then came the injection. The chemicals clogged halfway through, causing a delay. It takes 18 minutes for it to be over. At 12:58 a.m., Gasey's dead. Some say his last words were "kiss my ass." Others say he didn't say a word. Others say he stayed silent. Either way, the man who had once entertained kids at parties was now gone. But how did we get here? How does a man who dresses up as a clown for sick children end up killing more than 30 boys and men, and bury them all beneath his own house? Well, the sick thing was that to most people, Gasey looked harmless. Like this guy was well known in Chicago's neighborhoods. He ran a well-known construction business, and he pretty much helped out whoever he could, loaning out his snowplow, waving at his neighbors, cooking for the block parties, and was even active in local politics. But that's the point, isn't it? Because behind that friendly smile was a freaking monster. And underneath the floorboards of his quiet ranch-style house on Summerdale Avenue were bodies, dozens of them. Gasey had a routine. He would take in boys and men, some looking for jobs and others just at the wrong place at the wrong time. But he would promise some quick cash, a place to crash, and a shot at some work in his company maybe, PDM Contractors. Now once they were in his house, he would tell them about this magic trick, and he would show them a pair of handcuffs and then pretend that it's all part of his clown act. He even handcuffed himself to prove that, hey, it's safe. But then came the moment. They would put on the cuffs, and then the door gets slammed shut. What happened next would be beyond horrifying. This guy assaulted and tortured him, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. He called his final move the rope trick. Yeah, it was no trick, but a slow, calculated murder, as he would loop a rope around their neck and slowly tighten it with a hammer handle. And then it was done. he would bury them under the crawl space or toss their bodies into the river. Some of these poor boys were never identified, and for years no one knew anything. The police had questioned Gasey before, sure, but this bastard talked his way out every time. This guy was just too normal to be a suspect. Until December 11th, 1978. So we got a boy named Robert Peast, and he disappears after work. He tells his mom he's going to be right back. He's just going to talk to a man about a job. But that man was John Wayne Gasey, and Peast never came home. That disappearance lit a fire under the Des Plaines Police Department, and they started looking harder. Now they found out about Gasey's past, which was a prior conviction for assaulting a boy. So they followed him, even got a search warrant, and then searched his house once. Nothing. But that smell from the floorboards stuck with them. So they decided to do a second search. And that's when they found it. Bones and human remains. Dozens of them, all buried under the crawl space. By 1980, when Gasey's trial started, the courtroom was packed. His defense tried to go insanity. His defense would plead insanity, claiming that this guy had split personalities, one of them being called Bad Jack and the other one Pogo the Clown. Yet the jury wasn't buying this. It was just too much planning, too much cover-up, and too many victims. He was found guilty of 33 murders, the most by one person in U.S. history at the time, and was sentenced to death. And this guy spent 14 years on death row, during which he was claiming innocence. And according to his lawyer, he wasn't even scared of dying. He would joke with the guards, got visits, and even had fans. Yes, fans. But as the years passed, the countdown to his final moment never stopped. On May 9th, 1994, Gasey's taken to Stateville Prison for his execution. And just after midnight, he's strapped down, and that injection begins. But during the procedure, there's a problem. The drugs had solidified, the line clogged. They had to replace it. It takes 18 minutes for him to die. 18 minutes of him staring at the ceiling, strapped down with no mask to wear. No character to slip into, and no way out this time. Some said it was too long, others said it still wasn't enough. But in the end, we thank Robert Peast for helping change the laws. In Illinois, they removed the 72-hour wait before launching a search for missing kids. This would all eventually evolve into what we know now as the Amber Alert. So yeah, justice was kind of served, but it came after a lot of damage. And now Gasey's not remembered for who he pretended to be, but for the monster he really was. October 7th, 1993, just a regular evening at Whitmore Prison, England. Inmates on Bailey's wing were allowed to roam around, talk, maybe play cards, or check on their cellmates. Nothing unusual. And then someone walked into Leslie Bailey's cell, and minutes later, he's gone. They find him lying there, face pale, lips blue, a ligature still wrapped around his neck. The thing was that Bailey wasn't even in a regular cell block. He was being kept in a segregated wing, away from the general population. It's where the prisons place the so-called high-risk inmates, people like chomos, sex offenders, and informants, people who wouldn't last long if they were mixed in with the others. And yet, someone still got to him. Bailey was serving a life sentence for what he did, because the UK doesn't have a death penalty. But somebody inside this prison decided life behind bars wasn't enough. To them, Bailey didn't deserve to keep breathing. So we're going to tell you what Bailey did, and you'll understand why. On June 1st, 1984, Mark Tildesley was so excited to go to the fun fair in his hometown of Wokingham. This kid saved up his coins, mostly by returning shopping trolleys to collect the 10p deposits, the kind of sweet determination only a kid has. And so, that afternoon, Mark left home on his little bike. He tells his parents he's going to be back by 7:30 p.m. He never came back. His parents found that little bike chained up outside the fairground gates. But no sign of Mark. They called the police. They search everywhere for him. Posters go up, and hundreds of people call the hotline. His case is aired on the very first episode of Crime Watch UK. But for years, no one knew what really happened to Mark. Until Leslie Bailey talked. Now, Bailey wasn't just some random guy off the street. He was part of this gang, one the police would later call the Dirty Dozen. It's a network of predators led by a man named Sidney Cook, who hunted boys. Now, according to Bailey's own confession, on the night Mark vanished, he drove 2 other gang members, Cook and Lenny Smith, from London to Wokingham. They had a plan. They were going to meet at a caravan parked near the fun fair, and they called it a party. Cook found Mark and offered him sweets, promised him a ride on the Dodgems. And when the moment came, he grabbed him and then forced him into the car. What happened next in that caravan is hard to say out loud. The men drugged this poor kid and abused him and eventually killed him. Now, Bailey later said that he thought Mark might have already been dead before he left that night. Cook had told him the boy was fine and that he would take him home, but we know now that was never going to happen. Years later, Bailey ends up in prison for manslaughter of another boy, Jason Swift. And during his sentence, he started talking. He confessed to Mark's murder, drew a map, wrote letters, and told the police everything. He said he was even shocked that Cook and Smith weren't being charged as well. He tells his lawyer to ask for the max sentence, like he knew he deserved it. Still, despite naming the other 2 men involved, Bailey was the only one charged. Cook and Smith denied everything, and prosecutors felt that Bailey's word alone wasn't strong enough to convict him. So, Bailey takes the fall alone. And then, someone takes justice into their own hands. A year after he's sentenced for Mark's murder, Bailey's found dead in his cell. 2 inmates, Michael Caine and John Brooks, are later convicted of. It's believed they did it to avenge the boys Bailey had hurt. Bailey was in a Rule 43 unit, what prisons call a protective wing. But during a free association period, prisoners are now allowed to visit each other. And that's when it happened. When news broke out about Bailey's death, little Mark's parents didn't pretend to be sad. In fact, they said they welcomed it. And can you blame them? After Leslie was sentenced, Mark's mom had called for the reintroduction of the death penalty, saying,
He should have been hanged.
And well, Caine and Brooks made that wish come true. You're not going to find this type of justice in law books. But for many, it felt like the only one that made sense.
Richard Huckle those children, and he got them to a point that he was certain that no matter what he did to them, they would not tell their parents of the abuse that they were suffering from him.
October 13th, 2019. By the time the guards found Richard Huckle, it was already too late. This guy was face down in his cell at Full Sutton Prison in Yorkshire, England. His hands and feet were tied, and he was brutally assaulted, showing signs of unimaginable torture. A makeshift blade was lodged deep into his skull, through his nose. And just like that, one of Britain's most hated predators had been killed. And not just killed, but destroyed. The kind of rage behind that murder said one thing loud and clear. Someone wanted to make this guy suffer. And that someone was Paul Fitzgerald, a fellow inmate serving time for violent sexual crimes of his own. Fitzgerald didn't just lash out in a moment of rage. This attack was premeditated, calculated, and, as he later put it, his idea of poetic justice. And while nothing could undo what Richard Huckle had done for many, especially those who knew of his crimes, that death felt like the closing of a horrifying chapter. And before he was convicted, Richard wasn't the kind of guy that would raise alarm bells if you passed him on the street. Brought up in a middle-class home in Ashford, Kent, he would go to grammar school, travel, and even attend church regularly. Now, he called himself a Christian missionary, but behind all that was something unthinkable. At 19, Huckle first visited Malaysia during a gap year. Now, he said he wanted to help. He would volunteer, photograph community events, and even work with local churches. People welcomed him in, saw him as a kind outsider with good intentions, and he would use that trust to get close to little boys and girls, many from poor, vulnerable families who thought he was offering them some kindness. Instead, he was grooming them, abusing them, and documenting it all in secret. This sick shit went on for nearly a decade. Huckle abused dozens of boys and girls in Southeast Asia, mostly Malaysia. But he wouldn't just commit abuse. He created a twisted point system to keep track of what he'd done to each victim, actually referring to it as his points. He photographed and filmed the assaults, uploading them to a dark website known to other predators. But the worst part of it all was that he turned it into a business. Yeah, he was writing a manual for other abusers on how to exploit poor communities and avoid getting caught. But he didn't stay invisible forever. In 2014, Australian authorities investigating his online abuse network noticed a user who stood out. This guy was confident, brazen, and had a signature greeting, Hayes, even bragging about the scale of his crimes. This was Richard Huckle. Authorities tracked him down and alerted Britain's National Crime Agency. Just before Christmas, as Huckle's flying into Gatwick Airport to spend the holidays with his family, officers are waiting. They arrest him on the spot. He doesn't say much during his initial questioning, but the digital evidence found on his laptop is more than enough. Over 20,000 images and videos, some so deeply encrypted that police still haven't cracked him yet. So after his arrest, Huckle confessed everything to his mom. Obviously, his parents are horrified. They kick him out of their home and call the police right back, themselves. 2016, Huckle pleads guilty to 71 charges. Yet to this day, authorities believe that he may have had up to 200 victims, most of whom will never be identified. This guy was given 22 life sentences. The judge called it a campaign of abuse, of astonishing depravity. But even then, people are so pissed off that this guy is eligible for parole after 25 years. Well, 3 years later, Huckle's killed in prison. His killer, Paul, had a long history of disturbing crimes and mental illness. But in this case, he tells investigators that he acted deliberately. He wanted to hurt Huckle in a way that reflected the pain he had caused others. That attack lasted over an hour. Fitzgerald later said that he planned to cook and eat parts of his body, but time kind of ran out. And when the trial began, Fitzgerald showed no remorse. He called it revenge for all the innocent victims. So the judge gives him life in prison, with a minimum of 34 years before parole. Fitzgerald probably thought it was worth it, because in the end, justice didn't come with a gavel. It came from a locked cell, a quiet hallway, and one dude who decided enough was enough.
Я не задумывался об этом встрече, как-то не задумывался я. Все это я считаю, что все это.
It's February 14th, 1994. We're in a soundproof room inside a Russian prison. A guard raises his pistol and fires a single bullet behind the right ear of a guy who had terrified an entire country. And just like that, Andrei Shiclo, the butcher of Rostov, was dead. And the horrors he left behind still echo decades later. So, what the hell deserves such a fate? At first glance, Shiclo didn't look like a monster. A soft-spoken father, a former schoolteacher, and even a member of the Communist Party. He held a degree in literature, wore glasses, and blended in. But behind closed doors, he was hiding a darkness so deep, it took the Soviet Union years to believe someone like this guy could exist. Between 1978 and 90, bodies kept turning up, stabbed, plated, and left in forests and fields across Russia and Ukraine. The victims were usually minors and women. Many had their eyes gouged out or their mouths stuffed with dirt. The violence was shocking, and the pattern was unmistakable. But the killer was always nowhere to be found. Turns out the man they were looking for was hiding in plain sight. We have Andrei, not some crazed figure lurking in the shadow, but a father, a husband, and a schoolteacher. To most, he was just another aging Soviet citizen, quiet, polite, and harmless. At least that's how it seemed. Who could have known his real nature? At least, that's how it seemed. 1936. The aftermath of a devastating famine. He was born in a small Ukrainian village. Shiclo would grow up hungry, literally and emotionally. His mother would scare the crap out of him, telling him that his older brother had been kidnapped and eaten by starving neighbors. Whether it's true or not, that stained him. And as a boy, Shiclo was small, shy, and constantly bullied. His father was labeled a coward during World War II, which didn't help. And by his teens, Andrei was already spiraling emotionally, deeply insecure, socially awkward, and suffering from sexual dysfunction. And when his attempts at relationships failed, he internalized the shame, later saying,
I thought no one would want such a shamed man.
But shame, as we've seen before in true crime, can fester into something much more dangerous. By 1978, Shiclo murdered a girl named Yelena Zakotnova. He lured her from this bus stop and then brought her to an abandoned area and just ended her life in a way too graphic to describe here. What's worse, though, is that he walked free because another man was wrongly accused and executed for that crime. It would be that mistake that gave Shiclo time, years of it, time to kill again and again and again. By the mid-80s, it was clear the Soviet Union had a serial killer on its hands, a fact authorities were too hesitant to admit. Serial murder wasn't supposed to exist in the ideal Soviet society, but the bodies kept piling up. Shiclo killed fast, killed often, and for years, he got away with it. At one point, he was even arrested, but then released because his blood type didn't match forensic evidence from the crime scene. 1990, finally, it wouldn't be forensics that brought him down. It was luck. And the keen eye of a young patrol officer who noticed Shiclo acting suspiciously near a train station. Well, he was arrested again, but this time, they had him. Investigators bring out psychiatrist Alexander Bukhanovsky to talk to him, not like a cop, but like someone who wanted to just understand. And it worked. Shiclo opened up about everything, confessing to 56 murders in chilling detail that only a real killer could have known. At his trial, this monster's kept in a literal metal cage. Not just for protection, but symbolism. The public wanted a monster locked up like one. And throughout the hearings, he rambled, sang, and even exposed himself. The behavior was so chaotic, but the verdict was so clear. Guilty. And the judge called him a mad beast and sentenced him to death. On February 14, 1994, Shiclo was executed for his crimes with a shot to the head, and then buried in an unmarked grave. Goodbye. Shiclo once said, though,
I am a mistake of nature.
And maybe he was, but that mistake cost dozens of lives, tore through families, and haunted a nation for years. September 16, 1989, deep inside a Soviet prison, behind thick concrete walls and locked iron doors, Anatoli Slifko took his final breath. He was led into a soundproof room, forced to his knees, and executed with a single shot to the head. Slifko wasn't a name most people knew at the time. On the surface, we have another well-respected youth leader, a husband, and a father. He ran a popular adventure club for boys, won awards for his educational efforts, and was praised for keeping the youth out of trouble. But dear God, behind that very constructed image lived a predator, one of the most terrifying in the country, mind you. December 28, 1938. Anatoli's born in a small Soviet town near the Caspian Sea. And just like Shiclo, his early life was also shaped by hunger, war, and trauma. Now, this was a quiet kid, sickly, often lost in his own head. His childhood wasn't easy. His father was an alcoholic. His family was poor. And he grows up during a time when food was a problem and fear was constant. But there was one moment that would change everything. 1961. When Anatoli was 22, he sees something that stays with him forever. A drunk driver crashes into a group of people, killing a boy right in front of him. The boy was wearing a young pioneer's uniform, similar to the Boy Scouts. And instead of horror or grief, Slifko felt something else, something deeply disturbing. He later talked about the smell of gasoline, the blood on the pavement, and how, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, that moment aroused him. That feeling haunted him, and then it would begin to shape his desires. By the mid-1960s, Slifko had started this youth club in the city of Nevyomysk. Both the parents and the kids loved it. He took them on hikes, taught them survival skills, and just kept them entertained. Yet nobody knew what he was actually using this club for. You see, behind the scenes, this guy convinced certain boys to help him with experiments. He said that he'd been reenacting a scene from history or even testing on how hanging could improve posture. But what he was really doing, pretty sinister. Slifko would carefully plan everything. He would pick the boys, have them fast for hours beforehand, dress them in clean uniforms, and then film as he hung them until they passed out. Once unconscious, he them and often masturbated onto their shoes. He would then wake them up, clean them off, and then tell them that nothing happened. Most of them never remembered anyway. He didn't do this once, not twice, but over 40 times. And 7 of these times, the boys didn't wake up. And guess what happened? Slifko didn't panic. He dismembered their bodies, set them on fire, and kept their shoes as trophies. So, my skin's already crawling. How the hell did he get away with this? For over 2 decades, he lived this double life, building a perfect image that the police could never suspect him. Even when the boys started to disappear. You know why? Because he's the one organizing search parties and even comforting grieving families. Meanwhile, he would keep detailed journals and home videos of everything he did. One of his victims, a boy named Sergei Pavlov, was the turning point. In 1985, when he went missing, a local prosecutor named Tamara Languyeva started digging, and she would notice a pattern. Many of the missing boys had been a part of Slifko's club. Now, some of the survivors would share some disturbing stories of being hanged and passing out during club activities. Tamara trusted her instincts and pushed for a search of his darkroom, and what they found was disgusting. Photos, films, victim shoes, and diaries describing everything in graphic detail. Faced with a mountain of evidence, Slifko confessed. He walked police through his crimes and even led them to the remains of 6 victims. In total, he admitted to killing 7 boys and assaulting at least 36 more. At first, he tried to play it off, saying the deaths were accidents, but the evidence was overwhelming, and he was sentenced to death in 1986. In his final days, they interviewed him to get into the mind of a serial killer. He would talk about fantasies, his methods, and how he managed to hide in plain sight for such a long time. He even gave suggestions, like better education in schools, to prevent future predators like him from emerging. And then on September 16, 1989, Anatoli Slifko was finally executed. In the end, what makes his story so terrifying isn't just what he did, it's how well he hid it. You see, he wasn't a loner or an outcast. This guy was trusted, admired, even celebrated. Kinda makes you wonder, doesn't it? Do you ever know who someone truly is?
Why do you want to be executed?
I have to be. Because I will kill again.
It's January 5th, 1993, just after midnight. Inside a quiet chamber at the Washington State Penitentiary, Wesley Allen Dodd takes his final breath. There's no last-minute appeal, no dramatic outbursts, just a hood, a noose, and silence. It was the first legal hanging in the U.S. since 1965, and Dodd had asked for it. Not just accepted it, asked for it. He said it was the only way to stop himself. That if he ever got out, he'd probably kill again. And after everything that had come to light, no one really doubted him. But how did we get here? Once again, on the outside, Dodd looked ordinary. This guy had warehouse jobs, kept to himself, lived in Vancouver, Washington, and wasn't the kind of guy you would notice in a crowd. Now, behind closed doors, this guy's leading a life so dark it shakes an entire community. 1989, he kills 3 boys, Cole Neer, his brother William, and Lee Izelli. Each of them were targeted, abused, and killed in ways too cruel to even comprehend. You see, Dodd kept a diary where he jotted down everything: plans, actions, thoughts during the murders. He wrote about them in a way that a normal person would write about their day. That alone left investigators shook. Todd's obsession with boys started when he was a teenager, and over the years it got worse. From exposing himself to neighborhood boys to masturbation and eventually murder. Now, he was caught multiple times, arrested even, and given short sentences and court-ordered therapy. But somehow he kept slipping through the cracks until one day he didn't. November 13th, 1989. Dodd had tried to abduct a boy from a movie theater in Camas. Now this time, someone noticed. The staff had chased him down, and then his car broke down just blocks away. A man stepped in, stalled him, and held him until police arrived. When they finally searched his home, dear God, scrapbooks of newspaper clippings, his torture plans, the diary, and even the underwear of one of his victims. Dodd confessed almost immediately to everything, and at his trial, he wouldn't fight the charges. In fact, he insisted on the death penalty, saying that the justice system had given him chance after chance and that he used it every single time to hurt more boys. He tells the court,
"If I do escape, I promise you I'll kill and again, and I'll enjoy every minute of it."
Anything happened, I can guarantee I'd do it again, and sooner or later I would kill another child. I've done it before, and at the time I liked it.
It's one of those rare times where there seemed to be no question. Even those who opposed any kind of death penalty was like,
"If there's ever a case for it, this might be it."
When they gave Dodd the choice of how he wanted to die, he goes with hanging, because that's how he took out Lee Izelli, his youngest victim. 12 reporters watch as Dodd is led into the gallows, walking in calmly, saying a final few words about finding peace through religion, and then stands over a trapdoor. The noose is fitted around his neck and the hood placed over his head. Then, snap. Reporters later said how surreal it was. One guy said it felt like watching a mannequin in a store window until you remembered it was a real person and then you're watching the end of a real life. A horrifying life, but a life nonetheless. Dodd's execution sparked a lot of conversations about justice, the death penalty, about how someone like him slipped through the cracks so many times. But one thing most people agreed on was that this man never harmed another boy again. And years later, those who were there that night still remember the silence after that drop. Not relief or even celebration, just a heavy quiet, like the closing of a very dark, very long chapter. And maybe for the families left behind, just a little peace. March 16th, 2005. It was early morning in Baghdad, Iran, when people started pouring into the town squares. Not dozens or hundreds, but thousands. A lot of people were angry here, some were just looking for closure, and many to see justice served with their own eyes. At the center of it all stands a man, shirtless and tied to a metal post. This guy is Mohammed Beij, and for months, he'd been the face of fear in Iran. A predator who once had lured boys into the desert, had done the unthinkable, and then vanished back into society like nothing happened. But that morning was the end of the road. Now before the hanging, they publicly whip him 100 lashes while the crowd watched. Some threw stones, some cried, some cheered. It was biblical. One victim's brother even broke through the police line and stabbed him. And finally, with a crane's hook and a blue nylon rope, the man who terrorized the town was lifted into the air and left hanging, silent, still. It was a scene no one would ever forget. On paper, Mohammed was nothing special. Just a 23-year-old guy working in a brick factory. He's living in a quiet small town outside of Tehran and the kind of guy you wouldn't even look at twice when you walked past. But in 2004, over just 6 months, this guy wrecked dozens of families. He would lure boys into the desert and pretend that they were going on a hunting trip. Then he would assault them, kill them, and then either burn or bury their bodies. Most of the victims were sons of Afghan refugees, families too afraid to report their children missing because they feared deportation. And that's partly why he goes unnoticed for so long. He picks out the boys he thinks no one would miss. A calculated cruelty. So the question is, how did he finally get caught? Well, it wasn't police work that led to him, but the bravery of 2 boys who managed to escape his clutches. Oh, they ran for help, described him in full, and finally authorities had a name: Mohammed Beij. He and his accomplice, Ali Gholampour, were arrested not long after. Now, during questioning, Beij didn't just confess, he detailed everything. He told the court that he planned to kill 100 boys, that he originally wanted to target the sons of government officials, but was too scared of getting caught, so he went after the poor instead. And in his words, he said,
"If I hadn't been arrested, I would have kept going.
Now, the trial was closed to the public out of respect for the victims' families. And maybe that was for the best, because what he admitted was way too disturbing for most to hear. So he was eventually convicted of 21 counts of murder, corruption on earth, and multiple assaults. The court sentenced him to 100 lashes, 15 years in prison, and execution in public. His accomplice, Golem Poor, was found guilty of helping with some kidnappings, but not the murders, so he got 15 years and 100 lashes. But Beij never got to serve his time because just a year later, on March 16th, over 5,000 people have gathered to see him punished. Riot police form a ring around the arena. Women clutched photos of their lost sons. Parents wept. Some shouted, "Death to Beij," and others just stood in silence, too overwhelmed to even speak. First, his shirt was removed, and then he was handcuffed to an iron post, where he got those 100 lashings. During this, a brother of one of the victims gets past security and stabs him. No medical attention is given. There's no point, because he's only minutes away from death. And then, a mother of one of the victims stepped forward, wrapped a blue nylon rope around his neck, and with a sudden pull from the crane, he's lifted nearly 10 meters in the air, until his final breath left him. The case left a lot of people asking big questions, like, why did it take so long to catch him? Could the police have acted sooner? What does it say about justice when a crowd of thousands cheer at an execution? In the aftermath, 16 cops were suspended for negligence, and there was some nationwide debate over public executions. Some said, hey, it was necessary for crimes like this, but others believed that it may have added more pain to an already broken system. But you know what? For the families of Pagdasht, it's not about politics. It's about loss, grief, and finally, maybe, a moment of peace.